I mean, firstly, I have to giggle because I feel that this topic comes up in every board presentation or executive presentation that I do, where there's this grappling of what's going on with this generation. They feel very different. We're not sure how to manage and approach this. You know, people want careers by design and not by default.
My emotions are not quantifiable many a times. I'm feeling something. Now, how do I put a score on it?
My daughter's first words are going to be AI because that's all she's hearing out of my office. Literally, the only thing anyone wanted to talk about was AI. And I'd never seen such a shift in the conversation so quickly in the human capital space. Employees are concerned about the productivity pressures, they're concerned about these AI tools that are coming in, but they feel a lot more positive when their organizations are checking in on them.
All right. Lovely to have you, Lauren, with us.
It's great to be here and great to finally meet you in person after having collaborated across so many countries with so many of your team members.
I know. It's been lovely. Qualtrics being one of my favorite brands over the years, and it's been close to about 16, 17 years for me, only looking at the HR tech space. And there are a few brands that come up on my mind who are trying to do very meaningful work, yet at the same time, the customers swear by that brand. And I think Qualtrics has been one of those brands that I have observed over the years.
Well, it's good timing we're meeting now. I'm freshly back from our kickoff in Vegas. So very ready to give you the download around where we're thinking from a strategic perspective, what we're investing in the employee experience technology space.
Do you think employee experience is still broken? And that's been one aspect. Some of the People Matters researchers, where we looked at the employee side of things, it actually came across as the number 2 element. Our employees have been telling us, fix employee experience. My CX side is so much better when I look at when I experience consumer-facing brands. But when it comes to EX, why do organizations not look at it as critically as they would look on the customer side?
And employees are seeing it correctly. I'm on that other side of things where I'm actually seeing how much are companies investing in their CX programs versus the EX programs. And that differential is significant. So while we're using the same processes around listen to your people, understand those experience gaps, take action to close them, the size of the teams, the amount of investment on the customer side versus the employee side is out of whack. And employees are feeling that. They're giving us a lot of feedback to say, my employee experience is not just about, do we have like a fun CSR day every year, but it's actually about the criticality of elements in my work that I need to get done in a more frictionless manner. So do the processes in my organization allow me to effectively serve my customers? If we're not closing those gaps internally, how are we actually going to deliver on that customer experience? So I think also, the fact that organizations see these as two disparate practices is a little bit odd. And in some quite visionary organizations, we're actually starting to see them come together in one experience management practice, where it's about how do all human capital elements, whether they're customers or employees, interact with our brand. And there's some really interesting research coming out of that space.
Wow. When you say that there is a need for a lot of work that needs to go into the EX space, and then we have different generations of workforce that are coming into play now, and it's only going to get more and more challenging. It's not good. This problem is not getting better. How would you look at organizations approaching this? What is it that you've learned over the years? If you could take us through the process of how would you go about putting your arms around this challenge?
I mean, firstly, I have to giggle because I feel that this topic comes up in every board presentation or executive presentation that I do, where there's this grappling of what's going on with this generation. They feel very different. We're not sure how to manage and approach this. It even comes up for me in personal dinner parties and barbecues where as soon as someone hears I'm an org psych, it's, what's going on with this next generation? Can you help me understand it? And I think to your point around, what systems can we put in place? For me, it's about taking a much more data-driven approach. We've taken a lot of stereotypes around different generations at face value. And a good example of this is, quite an ageist thought where things like corporate social responsibility are not as important to our boomers and to our older employees as they are to our younger employees. And we've seen consistently in the data that's actually not really the case. And similarly, in our recent research with the younger generation coming into the workforce, I think there's this stereotype that they aren't bringing as much energy, that they're sort of clocking off at 3 o'clock to go to yoga. And, what does that sort of mean for organizations and for productivity? And yet when we look at the data, we actually see that sort of 18 to 25-year-old workforce, particularly in this year's worth of data, is significantly more engaged.
Wow.
They have a better sense of well-being. They have a lot more positive sentiment about their leadership team, about the future of the organization. And all of that is quite surprising, I think, to a lot of organizations to see. And now, of course, that's not the whole story. There is a different side of that, which is although they're bringing all of this positive energy, this enthusiasm, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're committed to those organizations for the longer term. So we see that generation is thinking around, I'm coming in with all of this energy in order to gain a set of skills, in order to be able to enhance my career, in order to be able to, meet my needs as I sort of emerge into the adult world and start to establish myself. And so they are more mobile. They are thinking about, well, what might be the next job internally or externally? Might I think about this skill set being able to launch my own business on the side?
Yeah.
And so I think we misunderstand because we've been inculcated with this idea that if you're engaged, you're committed. And we're struggling with this generation having this juxtaposition of being engaged, but not necessarily having that intention to stay with our organizations.
And I think that's a very tough one to crack, right, for organizations. It's almost feeling like you've defined a work in a certain way. Organizations have defined it. Let's say there are circles, and then you have these square cubes and blocks that you're trying to fit into our defined way of what work should be, and what the new generation is expecting is completely different. And of course, there will be friction. Of course, there will be a lot of challenges in terms of trying to manage that. Do organizations need to think very differently on structuring work then?
Absolutely. I think not just the younger generation, I think many generations across the workforce have done some significant reflection over these past years. We've seen this radicalization of human capital practices through COVID and work from home. We're seeing societies become more affluent and having more choice. We're seeing a lot of sort of forces that have people think about their careers potentially differently. And I think the best, phrase that I've come across around this is, people want careers by design and not by default. So they want the opportunity not to be, square pegs and round holes. They want to be able to figure out how they can integrate their whole selves into that organizational system where it can really unleash their potential, where it can stretch them in ways where they also have safe spaces to innovate and to fail and to try. And I'm not sure that organizational structures as they stand are incredibly rigid. And I think that we're struggling with that. Our job profiles are rigid, our reward structures are rigid, and that's not necessarily allowing for this next evolution that we need, and that the next generation certainly is demanding.
I think the journey starts with a lot of deep listening, and because unless and until we are able to get to the bottom of where the need is or the challenge is, or we are constantly listening, I think solving is the next step.
Yep.
Because what you're essentially saying is a huge transformation that needs to happen in the way we look at work, where we look at structures of organizations. And what role do you think? Because Qualtrics plays a huge role in that segment in terms of listening, understanding, building. What's been the journey, and what are some of the best practices that you feel or you've been trying to drive?
When I was managing a human capital department, more than 10 years ago, it was quite revolutionary to do an engagement study once a year or once every 2 years. And now that would be considered quite antiquated practice. So certainly in our recent study, we saw that more than 50% of organizations are at least doing some kind of formal employee study more than once a year. Some up to monthly or up to weekly. Some are starting to bring in different data sources, unstructured data, data that's not directly elicited, to really be able to have that finger on the pulse of what employees are thinking and feeling. So I think one is around the frequency that we're listening. The second is around the depth. So I think we've relied a lot on qualitative data and quantitative data. So on a scale of 1 to 5, how do you feel about this thing? And that in that we miss a lot of context. So now we're starting to think about how do you ask employees in a more adaptive fashion. So if I feel unsafe at work, for example, can the technology help then prompt to have a conversation with me? Well, why do you feel unsafe? What can we do to help you feel more safe? So that we can get more quickly from that insight to that act. So I think it's listening more frequently, it's listening more deeply, and it's around taking those more actful actions so that employees actually feel that their voices are heard and these are not checkbox exercises within the organization.
I think it's a great step towards humanizing things as well, because when we were asking our employees to rate everything in quantitative fashion, you're again trying to push them, saying that, choose, quantify. My emotions are not quantifiable many a times. I'm feeling something. Now, how do I put a score on it? And that's where the qualitative essence becomes so much more important. And of course, nothing better than sitting across the table and having a conversation around it. Of course, you can't do that at scale. How do you do it with 10,000 people, 20,000 people? There is a need of technology, but how does the technology humanize the whole process is where some of those answers might lie.
Absolutely. And it's also in, how are we going to design what the purpose of that listening is going to be? So are we going to design it in a way where we want to be able to report back to the board that improved against this benchmark? Or are we going to design it in a way that this actually elicits from our workforce gaps and ideas that we can actually action upon to be better as an organization, not just for our employees, but for our customers as well? And this sort of goes back to the question that you had previously around, how is all of this listening going to help us with this revolution around how we become more flexible as organizations? And, one of the things we saw in the recent study is employees are concerned about the productivity pressures, they're concerned about these AI tools that are coming in, but they feel a lot more positive when their organizations are checking in on them around that job design process, when they actually feel involved in job crafting, when they actually feel given opportunities to create or to innovate or continuously improve the processes by which they serve each other and their customers. And so actually a lot of this employee listening is not about necessarily just, how do you feel today, but it's also about how, what are the ideas and the experiences that you are having that can help us revolutionize your ways of working.
I think it's fascinating to the era that we are getting into. And so what all AI possibilities are there, and how are you seeing the whole integration of, yes, we're wanting to personalize and maintain the humanness of things, and then you have new tech like generative AI coming into play, which would love to understand what's your take, and how does that help or supplement in fast tracking this entire process for organizations?
It's been very interesting for me getting into this AI space. So for a bit of context, I went on maternity leave at the end of last year. So I was off for 3-4 months and then returned to find that literally the only thing anyone wanted to talk about was AI. And I'd never seen such a shift in the conversation so quickly in the human capital space.
Yeah.
And I think the first few presentations I did in my first week or couple of weeks back from maternity leave, I was joking that I think my daughter's first words are going to be AI because that's all she's hearing out of my office.
Yeah.
And a lot of that was because it was a little bit unknown. There was a lot of hype at the time. So you've got your McKinsey's making big statements like, we're going to see these massive productivity improvements. We're going to see all of these business results out of it. And so your executive teams are hyped up. They're looking at where to invest, how to get in front of this thing. But then we're looking back at the employees and going, hang on, how are all of you feeling about this? Yeah. Originally, I think we started to see that there was a lot of neutrality or some negativity around it because there was a sense of, is this going to happen with me or to me? We've seen a slight more positive uptick. So if we look at sort of global stats, which are mirrored in countries like we're in now in Singapore, we're seeing around a 50-50 split, where 50% of people feel, this AI is going to make me more productive. They're already using the tools, whether it's their own or ones their company has provided them. That's another debate. And they're using it for things like, summaries, translations, etc. And then we're sort of seeing the other half we've got some that are still stoutly against, and we have some that are neutral, some that are sort of saying, wait and see, is it going to live up to all of the hype? And importantly, how is my organization going to use this? And one of the interesting things I think that I've started to see in the research is this really strong correlation between employees that are engaged and employees that are positive about AI. And that's really telling because that's actually saying, if you're on board with your organization overall, you're going to feel more positive. You're going to be more collaborative in the process of bringing this into your organization and making it effective. So I find it very ironic in organizations where they commit to $1 billion in an AI investment and they're struggling to come up with 100,000 for their employee experience programs because if your employees aren't engaged, they're going to be a friction for you in actually being able to unlock the value of this generative AI or whichever other kind of AI you're exploring within your organization.
I think one part is embracing. A huge part is about change management and what organizations need to do. A lot of that is signaling from the leadership and how are they looking at being open to this whole aspect, and it trickles down. It trickles down to everyone. That's what we've been experiencing when we are interacting with leaders, that if the signal is right and you've put enough emphasis on that change management, of course the friction will go lower. And then of course you need to then move forward while you do that on getting some of the strategies around EX right. Do you think our employees are still scared? And would you see a difference in the different generations that are there at the workforce? Do they see this differently?
I think employees, if they're scared, I think it depends on which employees.
Yeah.
So if we look at our senior executives, overwhelmingly excited about this because they're feeling in the driver's seat.
Yeah.
As we go down the ranks, so to speak, to our individual contributors in the organization, we see higher and higher levels of nervousness about this technology. And rightly so. Because although, change management is going to happen, it's about how is that change management going to happen? So is it change management, which is we're going to brand an AI project and call it something cool. We're going to send you lots of communications and send you on some training, which might go some way in making you feel a bit more positive or a bit more comfortable. But that's very different from systemic change management, which is we're actually going to sit down with you or find a way to allow you to voice up how you think that this will make you more productive. Or if your role is no longer going to have certain elements that are as time consuming, what is that going to free up for you? And, when we ask employees actually feel, well, if I was part of it, actually, I think I could do this element with a lot more quality.
Yeah.
or there's this other skill that I could bring to the table. And so it's whether or not we're able to achieve that change management, which is actually a two-way conversation, or whether we're still having a one-way conversation with our employees. And I think that's why, again, we see this difference between your executive leadership all the way through to your individual contributors around the sentiment toward AI.
Yeah. And do you see a difference in different countries as well, how it is happening? Because across Asia Pacific, if you were to look at, there are definitely countries which are trying to champion and be ahead in this entire AI game. And then there are, of course, laggards who are trying to sort of do things. Do you feel different countries are approaching this in a different way, and the workforces are experiencing it in a slightly altered way of doing things?
I wouldn't even say slightly, I would say quite starkly.
Okay.
When we look at the differences between country in positive sentiment towards AI, in sort of our Asia Pacific continent, we have India, Thailand, it's 80% plus sort of positive sentiment towards AI. And then we have, on the opposite extreme, Japan, New Zealand, who actually have a lot more skepticism around this. So we're looking at 30 to 40% positive sentiment around this. So actually the differential is quite significant. And then of course we have a lot of countries, like Singapore, where we're sitting now, which are sort of somewhere in the middle. It's sort of that, that wait and see type of approach. So certainly I think depending on the comfort with technology, how pervasive it is in our day-to-day lives, that seems to be part of it. So we've got, somewhere like New Zealand, where there's that idea of personal identity and personal protection is really key. And, what does this mean for me as an individual? Versus, we have India, that's such a technology hub, where there's this feeling of, well, this is bringing so much wealth and prosperity into the country. And maybe we really want to embrace this and make this productive. Because also, if we can't scale a lot of these resources, how do we give a better life to a population of over 1 billion people? So I do think every country is feeling this in very different ways.
Yeah. I think personally, apart from organizations, I think the role of countries' leaders is going to be very, very important. How a country's leadership looks at this as an opportunity, or it's okay, we want to play the catch-up game. I wish more and more countries' leaders put themselves out in the front, saying that, we're wanting to lead this. We're wanting to drive that change. And of course, organizations would follow. And it's a huge shift in terms of the way we look at work, way we look at economy, way we're looking at driving the whole ecosystem together.
Absolutely. And I mean, this is a bit of an off-the-cuff reflection, but I sort of wonder if the significant shift we've seen in Singapore around more positive sentiment has actually been as a result of some of the announcements from the government around big investments into AI, as well as the investments that they make here locally around making sure that the older workforce can actually keep up with some of these changes. Making sure that, when AI becomes pervasive, even post-retirement, that our elderly population are still educated on the use of smartphones and so forth, so that they're not left behind in all of this.
Yeah. Since we're on the topic of Singapore, I think I wanted to bring in the disengagement data on the table because that's only gone worst over the years. And you have more and more people in the workforce who are feeling actively disengaged. So how do you look at this challenge? And, do you feel it's only going to go worst, or organizations need to look at it saying that, I'm going to intervene and this is what I want to do?
I mean, I do think we see things swing in roundabouts a bit in the world of human capital. And we had an interesting phenomenon post-COVID that we hadn't expected, which is we actually saw a temporary inflation of engagement scores. So we'd expected that, during COVID and post-COVID, people would be feeling way more disengaged. But actually, contrary was true, where people somehow through that process, perhaps having less connection and other purpose in their lives because it became so constrained, had found that in work, had become quite grateful for having a role, had seen the juxtaposition potentially between their roles and our frontliners who went through so much during that time. And so we saw this actually globally and in Singapore as well, where we saw this almost sort of honeymoon period with our employers post-COVID that was quite interesting. And what we've seen probably in the last 12 months or so is we've seen a bit of a shift in that sort of power dynamic, where we're seeing organizations potentially get more aggressive around things like return to work policies. That's causing a lot of disgruntlement and discontent. We're not just seeing that locally. There's a lot of global news on that front as well. And so, again, that's sort of revisiting, well, does that mean that I should show up with all of my energy to this? Does that mean that I should go over and above for this organization if they aren't going to treat me with that respect that I'm going to be as productive at home as I am from work if I say that I'm going to be? So that's potentially part of it. Potentially part of it is this immense productivity pressure that people are feeling. So we looked at organizations where employees aren't feeling the productivity pressure and where they are. And there is a huge difference there in the levels of engagement. So as soon as you're putting that productivity pressure on, you're looking at up to sort of a 10-point difference in how people are reporting on their engagement. And certainly, in Singapore, we've always had a narrative about being productive. It's part of the society in which we live. But I think we're seeing even more pressure on the back of keeping our economy safe, keeping our economy stable in uncertain times. Organizations pivoting back a bit to those profit conversations more than those purpose conversations, and employee sentiment echoes that. You can't always have both all the time.
I think different economies also have their own stages of am I in a large growth run or am I maintaining? And that directly affects the job market as well. While you might have some of the developing ones who are wanting to go for that growth stride, where of course hiring and job roles are at a very different peak, versus an economy like Singapore, which is maintaining, doing good, where you have a lot of lateral hires happening or replacement hires happening, but not necessarily job growth in the digits that, let's say, an Indonesia would be experiencing or a Philippines or an India would be experiencing. So does a country look at engagement differently as well then?
Absolutely. I mean, if we look at country level engagement scores, in some ways they echo a bit of the AI sentiment, but not exactly. So in our region, we see very high levels of engagement in exactly those economies that you mentioned. In India, Thailand, Philippines, around there, slightly less so. Lower levels of engagement in your Japan's, your South Korea, Singapore, sort of somewhere in the middle of those two. And part of it is exactly what you mentioned. There is a component of, are you part of a growth economy? There is a component as well of, in a lot of those economies, there is still a large population of unemployed individuals. And so there is a sense of gratitude and commitment. Whereas in a geography where unemployment might be less than 1%, actually, having a job is a bit more of a taken for granted thing. And so actually you're looking for a lot more when it comes to your employee experience. So some of it has to do with, the economic growth. Some of it has to do with the unemployment rate. Some of it also has to do with cultural factors. So, Singapore is always an interesting case if we look at things like customer research here. So often, if you go to any store or have any interaction with an organization, they'll send you an NPS, a Net Promoter Score survey. On an 11-point scale, how likely are you to recommend this product or service to a friend? Now, in most economies, you sort of see a bit of a scale where, you don't see that many people saying, outrightly this way or outrightly this way. And the distribution is typical of what you would expect. In Singapore, we have a very high degree of neutrality. So very seldom will people say that's excellent or very poor. The way in which I often describe that is they're like, it's good but can do better kind of
Yeah.
sentiment. And I think
I'm not picking sides.
Yes, exactly. And I think we see that a bit reflected in the engagement scores here, where people are not necessarily actively dissatisfied with their workplaces.
Yeah.
You know, we often have quite good quality workplaces here, but it's more around, there is always that sense that there is more that we could do to close those gaps and to make that experience a bit better.
Interesting. I want to further go on this whole aspect of productivity that you touched, because that's one area where all the CXOs are looking at from a workforce standpoint. And then in some of the economies, there's this whole debate about number of hours that people are wanting to put in. Like, what is the number of hours weekly that you need to be at work, being productive? How do you look at this whole equation of productive hours and the number of hours that one needs to put in, and how does that affect on the entire employee experience part of things?
So you're giving me flashbacks to my days in Deloitte and organizational design, where we used to sit with massive spreadsheets.
Yeah.
And when we were doing significant organizational reorgs, we would try and quantify the FTEs, the full-time equivalents that are required for each particular role.
How can one forget FTEs?
Exactly. And then you would serve up these recommendations like, oh, well, this particular team needs 24.4 FTEs.
Yeah.
What is 0.4 of an FTE is a whole other debate. So yes, I think we are used to taking that very quantitative approach.
Yeah.
And part of that is sort of the rigidity of the systems that I've mentioned around we feel like we need to know how many job roles, how we're going to pay them, etc. But part of it is also that's the way we know how to performance manage people, because we've often defined performance in those very sort of Tayloristic terms of, how many hours have you sat at the machine, how many widgets came out of the machine, instead of actually being able to sort of find that balanced scorecard of outcomes. So even though we've done more around saying, well, it's not just what you do, it's also how you do it. Here's a set of competencies that define that. I'm not sure actually a lot of managers have truly internalized that. I think they often see that as sort of HR paperwork that's being created for them versus actually it's not really about the number of hours that this person brings, particularly if it's knowledge work. Because knowledge work might actually be about 4 hours lying on your couch at home listening to podcasts like this so that you can come to work with a fresh idea. Now, that's a really hard thing in a performance review to say, okay, how do I now put this person on a 5-point scale to decide whether they get promoted, what increase they get, what bonus they get? So I think the reason that we're so caught up in this idea of hours equals productivity is because it's an easier one to measure.
Yeah.
But those two things are not necessarily equated. So we need to get a bit more creative around how we think about that for sure.
I've always felt that our definitions of productivity in the last 200 years have come from the industrial and mass production way of thinking, because that's the entire sequence of doing business has been, and all the more reason that when you look at number of hours, you're talking about shifts, you're talking about production inputs and metrics. All of that is changing because of the kind of knowledge economies that we are getting into, where machines are doing their own job. They need less and less people to manage, but then that just leaves a huge creators economy, knowledge economy that's thriving, and number of hours and the way of measuring productivity, the whole definition needs a change.
Absolutely. And I think a really great example of this is how we define a work week. So there's all this idea that, the 4-day work week that is under discussion is revolutionary. Well, it's not. We came from a legacy of a 7-day work week.
Yeah.
And we went then to a 6-day work week, which was a revolution.
Yeah.
And in some countries like Thailand, we still have organizations operating on 6-day work weeks.
Yeah.
We went down to a 5-day work week, which has been generally accepted. But does that mean it's optimal? Well, the research doesn't necessarily bear that out. And we're seeing a lot of good case studies coming out of some of these 4-day workweek organizations to actually show that they're getting the same business results with that different operating model. And that should really be telling us something.
Yeah.
And some of the organizations that have been part of these trials are ones that even have frontline workers, because that's been the biggest pushback that we've certainly got in the world of org design is, well, we can't have a 4-day work week because we need someone, manning the front desk at the hotel or, serving people at the restaurant. But even then, coming up with more creative ways of structuring those hours and creating optionality and choice has actually allowed business results to stay on track while allowing people to manage and change their hours in ways that will allow them to be more productive.
I feel this whole definition is going to totally change. And the Gen Z that's entering our workforce is going to fight that battle, saying that, you know what, we don't comply towards industrial way of thinking work. And I don't know, maybe it's too early, maybe it's there's more time to it, but somewhere there's going to be that inflection point where new work, and I know we've had various versions of 2.0, 3.0, there's a big debate on that, but whatever that 0.0 is, there's going to be a new definition. And I'm pretty sure like people like you, brands like Qualtrics, you guys are looking at this space very closely, and what's that new definition going to be? And I personally feel that, that era is going to come sooner than later.
Absolutely. And for me, it's about what we spoke about earlier, which is, that life and job by design and not by default.
Yeah.
And that being far more in the hands of the individual, which is a more complex thing to manage. But we're seeing examples of how this is being unlocked, even with conversations around things like the skills-based economy.
Yeah.
Which is actually about saying, well, I'm actually coming to this organization with this set of skills, and I'm going to move around to work that needs to be done with those skills, versus I'm going to sit at this desk and do this set of tasks.
Yeah.
And to your point around generations, I certainly hope that the pressure of that isn't also on the incoming generation to be the voice of that.
Yeah.
Because I think many of us expect to have long careers after this and actually expect to have much longer lives.
Yeah.
Where we're not necessarily planning to retire at 60, get a gold watch, and then go cruising in the Mediterranean.
Yeah.
Many of us are even thinking about, well, we might retire from corporate earlier.
Yeah.
But then actually we might want to enter more of a gig economy, where what we would be able to do is offer up those skills and services that we've accumulated in order to keep ourselves sharp and engaged and productive later into the longer lives that we're leading. So I think every generation has really got a vested interest in having an opinion on this and in lobbying within their organizations with whatever influence that they have around this thinking differently.
Yeah. I fundamentally believe that whatever you tolerate, you get more. And I feel that more and more workers and employees are going to voice that out as well. The sooner we listen to that in a more qualitative manner and not just wait for them to put that out in a quantitative manner, the better it would be for brands and workplaces to drive that. This gets me to the point, Lauren, on the whole aspect of employee experience. Who owns it? And far for too many years, we've been putting the CHRO and the head of rewards and engagement at the helm of it, whereas the execution of that entire piece needs to happen through managers. How do we decentralize this whole aspect of employee experience and building that as a collective responsibility rather than a single department's responsibility?
I empathize a lot with our CHROs.
Yeah.
Having been in a similar position many moons ago and been an advisor to them for a long time, it feels like a lot of the things that are complex get put at the CHRO's door to solve, and and then simplified. And employee experience is one of those.
Yeah.
Like, okay, sort of get the study done, do something about it, and then that should fix this really systemic thing that actually touches all of us in every single aspect of our ways of working. So I think there has been a bit of that shift where our HR teams have become a lot clearer to our business that everybody owns employee experience.
Yeah.
And I think the first era of that was getting our managers and our leaders on board. So there's this idea of radically democratizing employee experience data.
Mm-hmm.
So when I sort of used to do these studies around 10 years ago, often I was reporting to a board behind closed doors. It was all very secretive. These are the scores, these are the benchmarks, this is what we're going to do, what are we going to communicate back? Whereas now in a lot of organizations, as soon as you have actually provided feedback, your immediate line manager can actually go in, see what that voice of team is saying, be guided towards action. So it's far more immediate, it's far more transparent. And we have examples of organizations that have even taken that one step further. So beyond just empowering the managers is actually empowering the individuals themselves around taking ownership for their employee experience. So in one particular bank that we work with in ANZ, there was this idea of, well, what about if we did team voice studies and actually the team got the result first?
Okay.
And then the team had time to come together and say, well, what does this mean for us as a team?
Wow.
And what are the things we want to ask back of our managers, of our leaders of our organization? And actually get them to voice up, because there's a lot of value to be unlocked there.
Yeah.
So that was a sort of seen as quite a radical idea. But I asked myself, well, why radical? If we look at L&D, it went through a similar journey.
Yeah.
So learning used to be, okay, CHRO, make sure there's learning courses. And then it was, okay, manager, make sure that your employee has got a career. And then it was actually employee, you need to own your career as well. And what we're here for is to give you the tools and the systems and enable you to be able to do so. And I think employee experience is going through a similar journey at the moment. And another example that I can use to bring this to life is in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. That's another type of thing that we often just put on the CHRO, or we put on the manager. But I found quite interesting in D&I Pulses to start to include a question, which is, to what extent have I taken actions outside of my daily role to make for a more inclusive team? And what's interesting in a lot of the pulses that I've reflected back to organizations on is often actually employees feel quite positive about how the organization is approaching DEI as a whole. They might feel that their manager is quite inclusive, but at an individual level, they don't feel that there's anything that they needed to do.
Wow.
And so I think with a lot of these things, whether it is diversity, equity, inclusion, whether it's my career, whether it's the job design, there is this idea that, if AI is going to free up all of this busy time, that actually how can I start to actively apply myself as an employee to these business challenges, which could make for very interesting work in the future.
It's fascinating, because on one side you have a lot of change that needs to be driven, and on the other side people wanting change but not participating in change. That I is very important somewhere in the definition of we, and we've been trying to do a lot of we in organizations. I think a lot of I gets missed out, and that I is so important. Without that I, you can't really drive things. Individuals putting their hands up and saying that, I'm going to own this. Managers putting their hands up and saying that, I will own this. I would want to drive that change. But that's the era we are in, and we are trying to fight that battle across.
I think often we hear that this is a cop-out of, organizations just handing the reins back to employees. And in some cases, I've seen that that's true. We don't invest in L&D and then we tell employees, well, own your own career. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about that if an employee comes back and says, this is how I can redefine my employee experience, this is the kind of learning and development that I need, this is how I believe my job can be designed, that something meaningfully can be done within the organization to meet that need. So it is still a joint responsibility.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think at a board level, a lot of CX metrics get tracked? even on the CEO scorecard, a lot of CX metrics would go in, and we have organizations when there are these live ticker boards on a number of customers we serviced and number of what's our customer satisfaction score and what's our web traffic. How about CX scores in EX scores in organizations? And how are we feeling? How is my team doing? Do you think we'll get to an era where all of that could also be tracked live openly with everyone?
I think we're getting there.
Okay.
I'm seeing organizations more open to this. And yes, to your point, CX metrics are everywhere. They're embedded as you walk through your day-to-day life. You are rating, after this, you're likely going to the airport.
Yeah.
You'll rate the cab on the way there, the cleanliness of the bathroom, how your interactions, your food on the plane. So your entire journey as a customer is tracked.
Yeah.
So I think the first step is we need to start thinking of employee experience as an end-to-end journey. So it's not just about these engagement studies, however frequent they are. It's actually about that pre-hire to retire process.
Yeah.
So from the time I'm applying to that organization through to my onboarding, through to learning and development, when I return from maternity leave, when I get a promotion, all of these things down to exit when I leave the organization, all of these are touch points where we should be embedding metrics that we're holding ourselves accountable for.
Yeah.
So I think before we can get to that sort of that North Star of all of these on a board like CX, we actually have to have the metrics in place and have to be tracking them in meaningful ways. The next is then proving to the business, well, what's the value of that? Because CX is a bit more intuitive. My customers are happy and therefore they will spend more. Or, my customers are more likely to return and therefore will get bigger wallet share per customer. So there's sort of a more intuitive linking. Whereas on the employee side, we have the sense that, if employees are happier, they would service our customers better. But it's a bit more ambiguous. It feels like there's a few more extraneous factors that sort of come into play. And many organizations have not tested this relationship out for themselves. They've seen studies that suggest it. So there's loads of studies that say those that have a better employee experience have higher profits, more innovation, better brand, all of those things. But it's an out there study. It's not a study with our data in the way that CX is. And so some organizations that we're working with are actually proving that business value in real time, where they're doing things like saying, okay, if everyone in the store that works in the store is giving feedback on their employee experience, as well as every customer going through is giving feedback on their customer experience, let's start to correlate these two things. And Adidas is a global brand we've worked with on exactly this. And so we were able to actually see that these correlations are really strong. So stores that have strong employee experience have strong customer experience, vice versa. And more importantly than that, we were able to dive into the detail of, well, which exact aspects of employee experience have a customer more likely to return. And that was things like training at store level. So we can get really targeted, not just at an organizational level, but at a store level, to say, actually, what are the things that we need to invest in the employee experience space that will give our customers better outcomes? And another great example of this that I use quite often is a large fast food chain where they were doing a similar thing. And one of the things they were looking at was satisfaction with food quality or taste, essentially, in the restaurant. And you would think that what would correlate with taste would be how much you're investing in your menu and your ingredients and all of those type of things. But actually, we saw really strong correlations with EX factors, like communication between team members, trust with your manager. That meant that actually that team was able to collaborate better against those menus, against those standard operating procedures to actually bring that taste experience to life for those customers. So I think for organizations to get to the point that you're talking about, where you walk in the morning and there's the board at head office that's got, well, here's how we're doing as an organization. We're serving this many customers because this is how our employees are feeling. The first step is we need to know how our employees are feeling, not just once a year, but across that entire employee journey and across all those moments that matter. And then we need to be proving to the business, why should we track this? What's important? And make it really actionable as well. So, at this store, you need to invest in communication. At this store, you need to invest in training. And this is the business outcome that it's going to have for you.
I truly wish that we get to that space soon, and more CXOs understand the importance of this whole aspect, that it fundamentally drives business outcomes. It's not just about being a cool workplace or a workplace that cares, but it's directly impacting business. And if you're able to get to some of the metrics that you were talking about on what affects which part of the business, I think that's where the conversation will get more and more exciting and meaningful. I'm sure every board member would want to know more about these metrics if we are able to correlate them in the way that you've just been putting it out.
Absolutely. And if it helps to inspire you, we're certainly doing a lot to bring those communities together. And I'm reflecting on a masterclass I held in Manila not that long ago, which had over 80 experienced management professionals. And I was doing an employee experience masterclass. And I asked everyone in the room, as I often do when I run these masterclasses, to raise their hand if they were from a customer experience team. And so far it's been a dribble. There's been a hand here and a hand there. But this particular masterclass, I was so inspired to see almost 20% of the room raise their hand to say all these customer experience teams had really had this light bulb moment that they needed to understand the employee experience side of things. So they were taking a half day out of their time, out of their lives to come and gain these knowledge and these skills and start to collaborate more closely with their employee experience colleagues.
Wow. I know we're totally running out of time. It's been a fascinating conversation. What do you feel in the next 3-4 years will dynamically change in the EX space? If you were to pick up one or two things that you feel will totally transform, what would they be?
I feel that technology is going to allow us to solve for the listening and the analysis challenge at a scale and with a depth that is quite unprecedented. So I think that the pressure on organizations to take action and to take meaningful action and to take personalized action is going to increase. And that's really sort of been the golden thread of our conversation right from the beginning. What are these new generations expecting? How are we going to adapt to AI? A lot of these answers lie within the voice of the employee. But just hearing it and analyzing it is not going to be enough. It's going to be about, can we fundamentally respond to those voices in a meaningful way in real time? And that, I think, is the next big challenge for organizations to solve.
Wow. Interesting. We've had a lovely, lovely conversation with you, Lauren. Thanks you for joining us on the People Matters platform. This is one of the newest podcast shows that People Matter from the People Matters family, which is the Humanscope. And we are intrigued to have more and more such conversations around, yes, technology, but what's the human side of doing things? How are we doing that at scale? And I'm so glad listening to some of the work that you've been driving and championing, as well as what Qualtrics been doing in the market. I really, really hope that all of that work translates into more happier, better workplaces that drive more and more business outcomes.
Absolutely. And I've thoroughly enjoyed today's conversation as well, and our partnership with People Matters. I think we are equally committed to making those workplaces just a little bit better for everyone every day.
Far more better. People Matters has been on a mission that we want to really, really enable talent leaders to take some of those decisions, and whatever change in thought process, taking leaps from where we are, whatever little role that we could play, that's been the journey. And I think collaborating with individuals like you, it helps us accelerate that entire journey. So thank you for being that.
Thank you for inviting me, and hope to see you again on the podcast soon.